thanks to the organization for accepting me this paper. This is the result of my doctoral dissertation, which involved the history of the idea of man as a microcosm, comparing Jewish and non-Jewish sources. So in order to see how the theme was treated in different traditions. And the result is a working hypothesis which I concluded my dissertation. So, throughout late antiquity and Middle Ages, I noticed that there were different ways. Can you hear me? My voice is not very okay at the top. So, the idea is that there were very different ways in which this correspondence has been thought or imagined, but for the sake of this paper, we only briefly examine the four relevant ones. So one way of intending the correspondence between the human body and the cosmos is a purely physical, or we can say aesthetical. So like the hair was compared to the trees, and the rivers to the blood vessels, the veins, arteries, and so on. The eyes to the sun and the moon. So it's a purely aesthetic or physical correspondence. Then we have the Platonic type of intending the way of the correspondence, which is based on the structure of the cosmos on one hand and on the human being on the other hand, which means that both were, according to Plato, are structured into three ways: material aspect, the body or the matter in the cosmos; the soul, so the word soul or the soul, the human soul; and then the intellect. So the human intellect is just one small part of the larger intellect. Then the Aristotelian way of intending this correspondence was that man's intellect can become more and more similar to the universal intellect the more he learns about the cosmos. So the more knowledge he or she takes in, the more the human's intellect becomes similar to the universal intellect. And then, which will be relevant for the present paper, is the so-called Mnemotechnics, which is the alleged correspondence between constellations of the zodiac and the parts of the human body. So the most beautiful example of Mnemotechnics is from this 15th century French prayer book. And this was one of attestation of the most common, basically universal Mnemotechnics that I've found. So, except some slight variation between the central area. So sometimes Leo is in the place of the Cancer, and Cancer is more. But besides small variations, the general scheme is this one. So Aries, we can see the Aries on the head, Taurus on the neck, Gemini on the arms, and so on and so forth, to conclude with fish pieces at the feet. So this is the most common way that I found, which most common kind of Mnemotechnics. So how about Jewish sources instead? This is basically common in astrology, astrological, and iatromathematical, which means astrological medicine throughout the West. So, but what about Jewish sources? So I noticed that in early Middle Ages, I found several examples in which basically Jewish texts deal with the first kind of correspondence that we see in the other slide, namely a purely physical correspondence. So, for example, the Pesita Charta, blood in the veins are compared to water in the rivers, and so on and so forth. Then, in late Middle Ages, in Jewish texts, we notice a Neoplatonic approach to the correspondence between man and the cosmos. and plus later Kabbalistic developments that I didn't deal with because they were outside the scope of my time scope that I set for myself. And then one text that stood out the most, not only compared to non-Jewish texts, but even compared with other Jewish texts, is the Сэфер Yetzirah, a book that of unknown time and place of composition. Scholars do not have a consensus, but it appeared before, it was composed before the, at least, at most, at the latest, at the beginning of the 10th century, when first commentaries appear, two in Arabic and one in Hebrew. So the text written in Hebrew deals about, wants to, for those who don't know it, wants to tell how God created the world throughout the use of the 32 paths of wisdom, namely the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and the 10 Sefirot, which, by the way, we will have, is the first attestation of the term Sefirot, although in this case, in this text, it indicates 4 elements. By the way, they're not the 4 classical ones, but they're spirit instead of earth, and then the 6 directions of space. So the Sefirot in the Сэфер Yetzirah do not have anything to do with how they were imagined in the later Qabbalah. Anyway, the Сэфер Yetzirah divides the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in 3 categories: 3 mothers, 7 double, and 12 simple letters. And we can see that when it talks about the correspondence between the letters and the constellations and the organs, also the 12 months that I didn't put in the slide, we can see that the correspondence between Aries and Liver, Taurus and Gal, they are totally different from the ones we saw in the other slide. Here's a comparison. We can see that in the classic Mnemotechnics, Aries corresponds to the head, in the Сэфер Yetzirah to the liver, the Taurus to the neck, but in the Сэfer Yetzirah to the Gal. Anyway, there's no point of similarity at all whatsoever, except maybe for pieces which are tied with the feet and the left foot respectively, but I think since it's just a coincidence, because there's literally no other point of contact. So I wonder, why is this similarity? Why is this? This is the only text that I found that presents this different sequence. Well, one of the first commentators already realized that. The author of the Sefer Hakmoni, the first commentary in Hebrew, namely Shabbatai Dormol, who lived in southern Italy in the 10th century, he realized that was this discrepancy, and he noticed that although the Сэфер Yetzirah says that with the same letter God created the Aries and the liver, but the constellation of Aries influences the head. And although the Taurus was created by the same letter through which God created the Gal, Taurus does not influence the Gal, but the neck, and so on and so forth. So he tried to reconcile the Jewish and non-Jewish, or the version present in the Сэfер Yetzirah with the astrological, the Greek astrological ones. That he could read Greek, by the way, he could read, so his position was particularly privileged to make this kind of comparisons. So, the Сэfер Yetzirah says that God created the world through the use of the letters, but they are arranged into 2 wheels, and God created the world through the 231 permutations of these possible, so 231 different combinations of these 2 letters. So when I made this diagram while I was illustrating the Сэfер Yetzirah in my thesis, well, this actually looked familiar, very familiar to me, because these are the 2 wheels of letters present in Giordano Bruno's De Umbris Idearum, the shadows of the ideas. We can also notice that there are Hebrew letters there, and it is a mnemotechnic treatise which is a treatise meant to improve techniques to remember series of things. So if you have a parts of the speech that you wanted to remember, which I didn't use, of course, or anything, any sequence, they were used. There was a system designed for that. He did not invent it. They were quite common in up until the Middle Ages, or the modern ages. But what struck me was the presence of not only Greek but Hebrew letters. So I thought, what if there was a connection in that? And not only that, but what if the Сэфер itself was a mnemotechnic device? So I realized that the Сэфer talked about a mysterious Tli, saying that it's like a king on his throne, and it corresponds to the wheel, whatever it is, galgal, whatever it is, and to the heart. And it's also shaped like a hook. So the root, correct me if I'm wrong, of Tli is the same of talui, something that hangs. Well, again, to find the answer to that, I went outside Jewish sources and I noticed that the Draco constellation is in the center, so maybe that's the reason why he said it was like a king on his throne, because it moves everything. It's at the center of the wheels, and also it's shaped like a hook. Well, it's not very clear here, but if you take some planetarium or stellarium, you can see that the shape is clearly like a hook. So these are the hypotheses on which I'm working on at the moment. What if the Сэфер is a mnemotechnic device? So what if the sequence of organs was not meant to be taken as a... It would explain why the sequence is different from virtually any other text that talks about the correspondence between the constellations and the human body. The biggest reason could be that it's not meant to be like, it's not that kind of text. It talks about something else. It talks about a series of elements, like the days of the week, or the months of the year, and they are tied with other elements of the body and tied with a letter. So the text, the Сэфер does not talk about influences of one constellation to the human body, but it talks about that with the same different series of elements are tied with a letter. So I thought maybe that could be a reason why, that could be the purpose of the text. And by the way, the two series of letters and their permutations for mnemotechnic purposes are explicitly described, although not in detail, unfortunately, so we don't know exactly how it worked. But they are mentioned in Aristotle's work on memory and recollection. So that could explain why there are two ways of letters. Also another reason why I think it's at least possible that my interpretation can be correct in some way, is that the Сэфер begins with the invitation to create silence in the reader's mind, in one's heart, which is, again, was considered by not only in Jewish sources, but by Aristotle as well, as the seat of the intellect. So, when the Сэфер says that the heart corresponds to the Tli, since we can see that the dragon is at the middle of the letters. So what if the intention was to make the heart, so the intellect of the practitioner, while imagining these two wheels of letter to become more similar to the dragon, so at the middle of two revolving letters, wheels of elements. So that would also point out that Сэфер does not also have Platonic or Pythagorean elements in it, as it's a common knowledge, but probably the Aristotelian element underlying it is been underestimated. Briefly, I just mention another text that makes me wonder. It's a Сэфер that, as far as I know, it's been published only in the Italian version in 1995 and then re-edited in 2006. It was composed in 13th century Catalonia, which describes 3 wheels of letters, so 3, not 2 this time, associated apparently with no other apparent criterion with Sephirot, planets, qualities, Bible verses, etc. So I wonder whether this text too was meant as a mnemotechnic device, because it appeared at the same time in the same region when Ramon Llull wrote the Ars Magna, which was the source of Giordano Bruno's Mnemotechnics. Just to give an example, we don't have time, but just to give an example of why I think there was a direct influence of between Llull and Jewish tradition. Well, it's a working hypothesis, so I'm not claiming anything for certain, but I think the question should be reopened. Llull wanted to create a system through which you can describe all reality just with the use of a very few words and symbols, and disposed on letters that were rotating. So the question had been ruled out by Umberto Eco, but I suggest that we should reopen the question, because Umberto Eco was not aware of the Sefer Temuna that I mentioned earlier, and then was not aware that another Jewish text dealing with mnemotechnics has been proposed a new place and time of composition, namely 13th century Catalonia again. So this is a new breakthrough in research that was made by Saverio Campanini, who suggested that the text was composed in Catalonia. That would, in my opinion, reopen the question that has been ruled out so far. Okay. Thank you. Questions?
Any questions? For example, I do have one.
Okay.
If nobody proceeds. So if I understood correctly,
yes.
The idea is that the divergence in some details between the Sefer Yetzirah correspondences, yes, and the common Europeans comes from Sefer Yetzirah being built in mnemotechnics. So my question is, and why should the mnemonic mechanism differ from a real mechanism, while why construct a false mechanism to mnemonize, or why not use the thing which is essential as a mnemotechnic tool? Why mnemotechnical and essential schemes do not should not, cannot.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by essential. This was the most common. Do you refer to this one,
for example?
Well, I wouldn't call it.
If everybody believes that there is a correspondence between object A and object A1,
yes.
Why to mnemonize it you have to make a correspondence between A and B3?
I see what you mean. It was not that widespread. It was not common knowledge. Also, during the early Middle Ages, when the Sefer Yetzirah was composed, or late antiquity, this sequence was almost nowhere to be found. So it disappeared for a while, for centuries, in the common discourse. And then it reappeared. For example, to find the first medieval manuscripts for this sequence, you will have to wait for the 12th century, so after the Sefer Yetzirah was composed. So my hypothesis is that it was not that common knowledge. Now it's almost universal. Now it's definitely universal, this sequence. But there was room for new ways of intending this correspondence. Also, there's a huge part that we don't know. There's ongoing research on Mnemotechnics in Babylon. There are still, so maybe the Sefer Yetzirah has taken from other sources that we are not aware of.
Thank you so much. More questions?
Just to follow up on that, it would be more compelling. It's great what you're saying, there's reasons to just have a different one.
Yeah.
But it would be more compelling if we can assign a reason that the letter type would correlate with memory somehow, and this other one would correlate more with cosmic, or I guess that's what you meant by essential. So I see that it's not going in that direction, but if I understood your question, then it would be beautiful if we could have a kind of causal correlation.
Yes, by the way magic texts or the way correspondences work, thanks. Thank you very much. They usually, when people try to make some theology of magic, or when they create systems, they usually are based on numbers. So if there are 7 things of one kind and 7 other things of a totally different kind, they tend to collate them together. So that's what I think the author or authors of the Sefer Yetzirah did. So they divided the letters into 3 categories. Then it turns out there were like 3 mothers in them. Then the 7 double, by the way, there are reasons why they did this. The 7 double are, it's not totally arbitrary, because 7 doubles are so called because they have, they are beget keferet, they have double ways of being pronounced. The text explicitly said this was the reason. And then the 12 simple. So I think they tried to arrange. The question remains, why did they leave out more important organs like the brains or the lungs? I mean, the heart has been put in correlation with what I believe is the Draco constellation. So we have the heart, but what about the lungs? What about the brains? I have no answer to that. But what I see that they try to make a system of everything. They try to make one system to describe everything. The cosmos, the time. Again, I didn't put the time here, the calendar, but you have 12 months, 7 days of the week, and 3 seasons instead of 4. So they try to make everything correspond. But
if I understand correctly, the idea, thank you for your presentation, of course, it's very interesting. And the idea of representing the microcosmos with a visual picture, you mentioned was meant to create silence, or silence in the mind.
Yes.
Yes. That's interesting. But maybe it's going far away to the Far East, to the idea of the mandala. I think that the culture.
Look, it's impressive. If you read the beginning of the Sefer Yetzirah, the way he describes, it really describes like if your mind starts to chatter, then you calmly put it in its place. If it starts to wander, put it in its place. If it starts to chatter, make silence. Really reads like a meditation manual. This is, as far as I know, a totally original Jewish. So it's written, yeah, it's a.
And then it's coming back with the Abulafia.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe.